Why Palladio remained relevant after modernism? The history of architecture is often presented as a succession of styles. Gothic was followed by the Renaissance by the Baroque, and eventually by modernism. Within this narrative, Andrea Palladio occupies a stable position as a principal architect of the High Renaissance and the most influential interpreter of the classical antiquity. Yet Palladio's influence didn't end with classicism. During the 12th century, his work became the subject of renewed theoretical interest, particularly after the crisis of modern architecture in the 1960s and the 1970s. At the moment, when many architects question the assumptions of orthodox modernism, Palladio was rediscovered as a source of architectural thinking rather than a historical style. What is remarkable is that this renewed interest didn't produce a single interpretation. Instead, Palladio became the point of departure for two distinct intellectual traditions. One emphasized the geometry, proportion, and compositional order. The other emphasized historical reference, symbolism, and cultural memory. Both claimed Palladio as an intellectual predecessor, yet they arrived at fundamentally different conceptions of architecture. This divergence shaped much of architectural discourse during the late 20th century and continues to influence architectural theory today. So let me go through the first part, the formal interpretation of Palladio through the theory and practices by Colin Lowe, John Haydock, and Peter Eisenman. And part 1, the formal interpretation. The first interpretation approached Palladio primarily as a designer of formal systems. Classical ornament was regarded as secondary. What mattered instead was the internal organization of space, the proportional relationships between parts, and the geometric principles governing and compositions. This reading emerged directly from modernist concerns. Modern architecture had largely rejected historical ornament, yet it continued to value rational order and formal coherence. Palladio therefore became significant not because he presented classical architecture, but because his work appeared to embody universal principles of composition. Within this tradition, architecture could be understood independently of style. Geometry constituted language that remained varied regardless of historical period or material expression. Three figures were particularly important in developing this interpretation: Colin Lowe, John Haydock, and Peter Eisenman. So Colin Lowe, discovering the deep structure. The formal interpretation begins with Colin Lowe's essay, The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, published in 1947. Lowe proposed an unexpected comparison between Palladio's Villa Malcontenta and the Le Corbusier's Villa Stein. Superficially, the two buildings belong to entirely different historical worlds. One is a Renaissance villa constructed according to the classical principles. The other is an icon of modern architecture. Lowe argues, however, that beneath these stylistic differences lay comparable compositional structures. Both architects organized their buildings through proportional systems, geometric order, and carefully regulated spatial hierarchies. Their similarities existed at the level of organization rather than appearance. This was a decisive shift in architectural historiography. Rather than treating history as a sequence of changing styles, Lowe suggested that architecture possesses underlying formal structures capable of transcending historical periods. Palladio therefore ceased to function merely as a Renaissance architect. He became an example of systematic architectural reasoning. And John Haydock, Geometry as a Transformation. John Haydock accepted the Lowe's analytical framework but transformed it into the design methodology. Rather than studying Palladios historically, Haydock investigated the generative potential of geometric operations. His early work, Diamond Houses, demonstrate this approach. Beginning with simple geometric figures, he explored how rotation, inversion, and proportional adjustment could produce entirely new spatial organizations. Although these projects bear little visual resemblance to Palladian villas, they preserve Palladio's commitment to rigorous formal discipline. Geometry functions not as representation. Haydock's contribution lies in shifting attention from architectural composition as a static object to composition as an active process. The significance of Palladio no longer resides in specific forms, but in a logic governing their generation. This interpretation moved Palladian thought away from historical precedent toward abstract formal research. And Peter Eisenman, Architecture as Generative System. Peter Eisenman extended this trajectory further by questioning the very notion of architectural composition. His early house projects employ sequences of formal transformations, including displacement, mirroring, rotation, and subtraction. These operations become autonomous procedures whose significance doesn't depend upon functional requirements or historical reference. In Eisenman's work, architecture is understood less as an object than as a visible consequence of an underlying system. Although Eisenman's theoretical interest later incorporated structural linguistics and post-structural philosophy, his early investigations remain deeply indebted to the formal analysis initiated by Colin Lowe and developed experimentally by John Haydock. Within this lineage, Palladio survives not as an image of classical architecture, but as a model of systematic design thinking. His architecture becomes an example of formal intelligence independent of historical style. Now, let me go through the second part, the semantic interpretation of Palladio through the theory and practices by Robert Venturi, Michael Graves, and Aldo Rossi. And part 2, the semantic interpretation. A second interpretation emerged during the same period, reaching almost opposite conclusions. Architects associated with postmodernism argued that architecture couldn't be understood solely through geometry and composition. Buildings also communicate cultural meanings. They refer to historical precedents, evoke collective memories, and participate in systems of symbolic representation. From this perspective, Palladio remained relevant not because of abstract geometry, but because his architecture demonstrated how form acquires cultural significance. The emphasis shifted from internal organization to historical communication. So Robert Venturi, complexity and historical reference. Robert Venturi challenged the reduction of architecture to formal order. In Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, Palladio appears not as the architect of perfect symmetry, but as the architect of control and consistency. Venturi observed that Palladio frequently introduced asymmetries within apparently symmetrical compositions, manipulated the spatial hierarchies, and allowed conflicting conditions to coexist within a coherent whole. For Venturi, Palladio demonstrated that architecture could embrace ambiguity rather than eliminate it. History, therefore, became an active resource for architectural invention rather than a collection of obsolete forms. In Michael Graves' Classical Language Reconsidered, Michael Graves approached Palladio primarily through architectural vocabulary. Columns, pediments, cornices, and windows were no longer understood as structural necessities. Instead, they functioned as signs capable of conveying historical continuity. Graves didn't attempt to reconstruct Renaissance architecture. He reinterpreted classical elements within contemporary compositions, allowing familiar forms to acquire new meanings. Palladio thus became a source of architectural language rather than formal structure. And Aldo Rossi, Memory and Permanence. Although Aldo Rossi is rarely classified alongside American postmodernism, his interpretation of history provides another important reading of Palladio. Rossi argues that cities possess a collective memory expressed through recurring architectural types. The theater, the courtyard, and the monument, and urban blocks survive successive historical transformations while preserving cultural continuity. Palladio's architecture, therefore, represents not simply Renaissance classicism, but a contribution to the enduring typological structure of the European city. Where the former lineage emphasized the geometry, Ross emphasized permanence. Where geometry organizes buildings, memory organizes cities. So here's a comparison: form versus meaning. The two interpretations described here share a common point of departure yet differ fundamentally in their understanding of architecture. For the former lineage, Palladio demonstrated that architecture possesses an internal logic independent of historical appearance. Geometry, proportion, and compositional relationships constitute the primary subject of the architectural inquiry. Historical style becomes secondary. For the semantic lineage, architecture cannot be separated from its cultural context. Buildings communicate through references, symbols, historical associations, and collective memory. Geometry alone cannot explain architectural meaning. These positions shouldn't be understood as absolute opposite. Both recognize Palladio's extraordinarily intellectual rigor. The disagreement concerns the location of that rigor. For one tradition, it lies in compositional structure. For the other, It lies in architecture's capacity to sustain historical meaning. So as a conclusion, Palladio as an open system. The continuing relevance of Andrea Palladio doesn't derive from the direct imitation of his buildings. Few 20th century architects attempted to reproduce Renaissance villas literally. Instead, Palladio became a theoretical framework through which broader questions about architecture could be explored. For some architects, his work provided the evidence that architecture possesses autonomous formal principles capable of transcending history. For others, it demonstrated that architecture inevitably operates within historical and cultural traditions. These interpretations are not mutually exclusive. Palladio's architecture accommodates both because it combines formal precision with historical consciousness. Its geometry cannot be separated entirely from its cultural references, nor can its historical meaning be understood independently of its compositional discipline. Perhaps this explains why Palladio has remained relevant for more than 4 centuries. His work doesn't prescribe a single architectural doctrine. Instead, it continues to generate new interpretation as architectural theory itself evolves. Palladio therefore occupies a unique position in architectural history, not simply as the author of exemplary buildings, but as an enduring source of architectural thought whose significance has continually been redefined by successive generations. Thank you for watching. I hope this video helps you better understand the foundation of architectural thinking more deeply. We are still climbing the ladder of the knowledge in architecture, art, and design. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below.